began with knots and notches, notched wood, quipus, which were knotted pieces of coloured string which were read with practiced motions of the hand like braille. Before text, there was textiles. Many forms of writing have no reference to the human voice whatsoever: seismographs, musical notation, circuit diagrams, knitting patterns. So now writing begins with noughts and ones. The computerization of capitalism has upended the old hierarchy of writing. Once upon a time, there was a hierarchy of written authority, beginning with a holy text, a constitution, a Bible, a royal decree. And now we have this new constitution, which no one was ever really consulted about, written digitally, not alphabetically. Its writing doesn't represent voices, but automated human purposes. Every computer program, as Benjamin Bratton says, is a political program. And this has looped us all into ever-expanding writing systems. We're writing more than ever before in human history, at school, at work, in our work breaks, toilet breaks, commutes, at parties. Some research says we even do it during sex. Must be particularly bad sex. Abruptly scripturient, then, we are possessed by a violent desire to write. And what are we writing into being, if not, in fact, yet more digital images, a la the Matrix? To live in a world of digitally written images is to live in a simulacrum. So we, by being looped into this, have helped birth the world's most profitable industry. I remember it used to be Exxon and Halliburton. These were the big corporate giants. Now it's Google and Facebook. We could call this the social industry. Calling it social media is like calling cigarettes friendship sticks. They can be used in that way, but that's not what they're for. The social industry emerged out of a capitalist appropriation of what you might call the cyber left, the ideas of free stuff, conversation, low-cost association, even protest. Twitter, for what it's worth, was originally modeled on a free activist app called TextMob, which had many of the same features, and it then went on to build its brand through mass movements, which were using Twitter in lieu of traditional political organization, and were able to thrive on the basis of a State Department minted slogan, which was called Twitter Revolution. State Department came up with that in regard to the Green Movement in Iran. So the industry commodified radical desires during a stalemate for political organization, and also thrived amid a crisis of sociality. It offered to make up for the massive decline in social interactions, measurable on several indices, whether you're dating, going out to the pub, and so on. All of these things have been in decline over the last few decades. As one of Twitter's founders suggested, where people felt alone, where they were in crisis, the network would be there. So the Twitter machine was really born just as neoliberal capitalism 1.0 was entering an historic crisis with the great financial crash and everything that followed. And it accelerated a crisis that was a slower brewing crisis of inherited political authority. And in so doing, destroyed the authority of journalists and news media, sucked revenues out of dying print empires, and in a positive way, ended the one-way traffic of ideological meaning. It used to be that you would wonder whether your protest or whatever it was you were doing would be reported in the news. Well, now it's going to be reported. It's going to be known about one way or another. At the same time, just as capital's crisis and austerity meant far less communal stuff and jobs available, the industry offered an abundance of seemingly free stuff. So what does it offer us in exchange for these conveniences? Since we're neither its consumers nor voters, it's neither a state nor a market, what does it offer us? Ostensibly, we're lab rats and wageless laborers. Far more than Adorno's culture industry, this is an industry that integrates us from above because it programs our interactions with an invariant written formula, producing subtle new types of conformity. A strange new techno-political regime traversing business and politics combines the surveillance powers of state, the market control of business empires, the ideological power of mass media. And it's more sophisticated even than mass media because it has no ideological agenda. It is in the reality shaping business. So it reaches us on a level that's both highly massified in as much as it's based on big data, how it works on us, and it's highly personalized in terms of our feed being carefully tailored for us. It has no message, but it's profoundly ideological. More vividly now than ever before, the medium is the message, and that message is always close by in our pockets. The condition for our access to tools that seem to lubricate association and wayfinding is that we write constantly. So even when we're watching a video, we're writing in the language of data. And of course, we can write to anyone we like. There's celebrities, there's porn stars, there's jihadists, there's politicians, there's royal family members. But really, what we're doing is writing to the machine. We confess our secrets to it, and it takes a digital copy of the message and passes it on. Our incentive, then. What is our incentive to participate in an industry like this? One answer is addiction. The guilty confessions of social industry bosses says that we are users much as heroin addicts are users. Yet if you think about it, what really is addiction? What do we mean by this? How can you be addicted to writing? Do we get a little dopamine buzz whenever we see the bright red notifications? Because this is what the social industry thinks. But dopamine doesn't actually give us a high, as neuroscientists will tell you. An addiction could be no more reduced to a chemical process than being in love or any other human experience. And perhaps addiction can be considered a form of love, a way of being devoted to the wrong things, when the relationships in our lives disappoint us or don't work. What are we supposed to be addicted to? Likes, shares, the lure of celebrity on a machine where the goal is to cultivate a personal idol. Except perhaps that, like all celebrities, we're constantly drawn to self-destructive auto-iconoclasm, the online shitstorm. It's a paradox that the social industry should be so addictive. The psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan used to say that addiction is addiction. It's a bypassing of speech. We get our enjoyment piped into our veins and thus avoid having to deal with people. It's antisocial. So we socialize now in an antisocial format. And crucially, addiction isn't all about pleasure. Smokers, heroin addicts, gamblers are all administering small doses of death, and so are we. We're hooked on the barrage of information, goading us into further interactions, every feed a force feed. You only have to scroll briskly through your timelines to see one or two or three items that set you off for the rest of the day. Drive you absolutely crazy, and the only catharsis is to type. And with the urge to write fast and the incentive of a competitive like hunt, a culture formed by the values of hierarchy, status, and competition that are worshipped by a handful of Northern Californian men who shape these devices, what we type will as often as not be, well, grandstanding, showboating, sadistic, backstabbing, trolling, facile, uninformed, because this is what happens when politically generative relationships and emotions are commodified. So we're devoted to what? A furnace of meaning, where the somatic onslaught of information never selects for accuracy. A volatile combination of stock market of sentiments, 24-hour news, and neighborhood watch, dominated by the network of media firms, politicians, marketing and PR agencies, corporations, sock puppets, trolls, micro-celebrities, and macro-celebrities who make up most of the traffic. You know, they once boasted of freedom of information. Information is never free. It is a system of controls and surveillance. And after the last 2 years of carefully tailored censorships, freedom of information reveals itself as the industry's code for its monopoly over its content, which must never be challenged either by users or regulators. So this mass production of information, driven by addiction, more now in recent years than in human history, actually serves to make the world more enigmatic, not less. Information includes what? Revenge porn, doxing, Tommy Robinson videos. Information is necrotic. It's what's etched on your headstone. It's the stars over your grave. Study after study suggests that time on the social industry is correlated to increased depression, self-harm, and suicidal behavior. But if we weren't already more depressed than we have been for a long time, would this be our remedy? And would the red pill be the powerful antidepressant that it so palpably is for so many young, specifically white men? We go on the machine because we're lonely and depressed, and it offers us an addictive remedy which makes us more lonely and depressed. The social industry is a chronophage, that is a monster that eats time. If you go to the Corpus clock in Cambridge, the monster turns the wheel and snaps its jaws shut to consume each second. An industry that monetizes time on device, as the gambling industry calls it, replaces the tick of the clock with the key clicks and thumb taps. A near-death experience measuring out its approach. Tap, tap, tap. The temporal experience of social industry platforms is different from clock time. As in casinos or pubs, where the signs of the passing of time are blocked out to keep you there, the social industry absorbs you into a different temporal flow. Following Natalie Dow Scholl, we could call it the machine zone, a state akin to the ticker trance that stock market junkies used to fall into. The industry doesn't tell you the time, it gives you the age of each post, information about the state of the game, so that you can roll the dice. It's also a temporality that's always intensifying, cresting towards culminations. J.M. Berger, in the context of ISIS and its recruitment strategies, talks about the industry as a carrier for millennial contagion. Time on the social industry is apocalyptic time. So if life is defined by what we attend to, the attention economy turns life into raw material for extraction. It drills into lunch hours, tube journeys, gatherings. Finally, 135 minutes a day. In a lifespan of 71 years, which is the global average, that's 50,000 hours. Addictions happen behind our backs in small decisions. I'll just have this one drink. I'll just answer this one tweet. Tap, tap, tap. That's your life disappearing. We don't have to do this. We are entitled to ask the minimal utopian question, what else could we be doing if not this?
Great, thanks Richard, thanks for that. And I know you have to get off, so we appreciate you came and made it, even though you just had the vaccine. Thank you very much. Brilliant. And Richard's link is in the chat if anyone wants to read more about it. I know I realise it's a hard task for our speakers to get all of their research into 10 minutes, but there we go, we want to keep it moving. I'll just go straight on to our next speaker. I'm going to introduce Julia Bell, who is a writer and the author of a new book called Radical Attention, which is a beautiful book, which I've read as well. It's an essay on the battle for our attention in today's age of digital distraction. And yeah, I think Julia's going to be focusing on the attention angle, the fact that our attention is disappearing through these devices. Over to you, Julia.
Hi, I'm just unmuted. I'm going to echo quite a few of the things that Richard has just said. And I think one of the interesting things is that we do feel like we're inside this mass experiment. You know, Mark Zuckerberg's famous quote, move fast and break things. And now we're kind of living with all these broken things and trying to figure out what's broken and how we can put things back together. Because I think the Timothy Morton's word hyperobject is appropriate to this moment in time. It's something that's happening to us, and it's very difficult to try and catch hold of it while we're in the moment of it. And I'm a writer and I teach writing. So attention is one of the muscles of my practice. I'm really interested in getting students to concentrate, to pay attention to the world, to pay attention to their writing, and increasingly was finding it difficult, both in my own personal life to write, but also seeing that affecting my students. So that was really what precipitated writing this book. And it's a mixture of personal observation and theoretical interventions and examples. So that's one of the reasons why and also my sister works now quite high up in Google, and I've spent a lot of time traveling to San Francisco over the past 15 years. And I feel like I've had a front row seat to some of the changes that have happened over there and the way in which the industry sort of took over the city and what's happened, how it's changed, and certainly some of its darker aspects. And I just want to talk a little bit about attention in terms of how we might think about it, what it is, and then how social media in particular, but connected internet companies leverage that for profit, and perhaps how we can think about ways of escaping from that. As I understand it, and I did quite a lot of research with Professor Chris Smith, who's over the road at UCL, there's broadly speaking two kinds of attention. There's a primal kind of attention, which is intimately connected with our survival instinct. So it's the kind of attention where we jump when somebody speaks our name or there's a loud bang. It's the nervous system on high alert. It stops you from getting run over, falling off a cliff. But it's also susceptible from prompts from your endorphins. So when you get a like on a post, you get a kind of small hit, it makes you feel good. And then there's another kind of attention which he can recreate in the lab, where you might get someone to wear a pair of headphones and you play two different sounds, one in the right ear and one in the left ear, and you get somebody to listen to what's being spoken, and we can attend to different things, what we look at. But this top-down attention is really easily distracted by the limbic system, by the bottom-up attention, which comes from the physical body. So a good example of this might be anger or anxiety. When we're very angry about something, our thinking is hijacked by all these endorphins flowing around our bodies. The same is very true of anxiety. Feeling then dictates what we can think about rather than more rational choices. And then add on to that the fact that I think, and again, this is another issue where we would bring in psychologists, to be psychologically healthy, we need to feel seen and heard. We need attention from other people. It's a very primal part of our psychology. If nobody sees us, how do we know what's real? And perhaps more importantly, how do we know where to find food and shelter? It's a really primal part of our humanity. And that also, I think, is being hijacked by this attention economy. Suddenly what we look at and what we pay attention to is worth an enormous amount of money. And the problem, I think, with particularly, and I'm going to focus on smartphones, is that it hijacks our attention in quite a few different ways. And I start this radical attention with a Wikipedia page which lists all the people who've died in accidents involving smartphones because the device has fritzed their attention to life-threatening situations like standing on the edge of a cliff. And I think if we had any other devices that induced mass death in this way, we might sort of force people to wear safety gear while using them in dangerous places or crossing the road or whatever. But the issue is that why should we? Because to do that would create friction, and these things were designed to be distracting. Persuasive technology, which was the gold standard textbook, which came out of the research labs in Stanford, written by B.J. Fogg, I can't believe that that's his name, but it is, was actually really at the beginning of the work that they were doing at Apple and then at Facebook and Google. How can we get people to use these? How can we persuade people to use these technologies? So a lot of that thinking was at the front end of the design of a lot of these apps and this technology. But the issue for me then is that the capture of your attention very quickly becomes problematic for the user. And the user is one of those words that we might associate more with drugs. The user is often trapped in this weird feedback loop created by an algorithm, which is really only interested in keeping you online. So if you're easily triggered by something which keeps you scrolling, the algorithm will keep feeding you more and more of the same. And in a way, the algorithm and therefore the company has an active interest in stirring up those feelings, because the more enraged and engaged you are, the more you're going to stay online. So you're trapped inside this weird feedback loop mediated by the screen, which is haptic. So you're connected to it very viscerally, physically. It's the electricity in your body that's making that screen work. And for me, I think recently, if you want an example from my life in the last week or a couple of weeks, was I posted a video on my Facebook by ContraPoints, who's a really interesting philosopher speaking about the issue with trans rights, and J.K. Rowling is a really fantastic parsing of that situation. It's a really clever, interesting hour-long lecture, which you can go and look at. So I posted that on my Facebook. And then the next day, Facebook suggested that I go and look at a conversation between two people who I'm still friends with, but somewhat reluctantly, who were very tough, anti-trans, angry about it. And Facebook was asking me to go and look at their conversation, completely unbidden. I haven't requested that Facebook tells me that or that it gives me that alert. It's shit stirring. Facebook wants me to go and have a look at that conversation between those two women that are having a turfy conversation that it knows is going to make me in some way engaged, but the algorithm's not differentiating between whether or not I'm engaged with it because I'm interested or whether I'm engaged with it because I'm outraged. It doesn't care. It just cares that I'm engaged with it and I'm going to comment on it and I'm somehow going to become part of that conversation. And I didn't at all. I was kind of aggrieved that at how much my experience of the social world was being mediated by the algorithm. I was being pushed in a particular direction, and maybe had I been a different kind of person, or I'm not paying so much attention to the way in which the algorithms are trying to provoke me into staying online, I might have engaged in that conversation and then felt very cross about it. But actually what I felt cross about was that Facebook was pushing me in this direction, and then also that conversation has consequences in the real world, very, very serious consequences for trans people in real life, but then consequences also for the user. As Richard was just saying, what do we do with our time? I spend 2 or 3 hours on Facebook being angry about this issue that these two people have said this transphobic thing, and that's 2 hours of my life that I'm not going to get back. And for me, attention is about how you live your life, what you do, what you think about, what you learn, what you want to be. Hours spent scrolling often puts us into this hypnotic state where we're not really learning anything or focusing on anything. We're just looking for that reward, somebody liking something or engaging with it, that interesting hit of having a feeling. And to me, at its worst, it's an absolute full-on assault on our emotional and intellectual freedom. At its best, obviously, having access to all this information and knowledge is beyond amazing. But what's problematic for me is how it's mediated. And it's mediated on behavior which is manipulated for profit rather than for human good, I think. And that's one of the reasons I think why this organization exists and why we're getting increasingly concerned about the structures that this kind of mediated world is creating in our real lives. And I think also what we're seeing, and I'm sure other people are going to speak to this, is a range of mental health issues, and I'm encountering this a lot in my teaching, which are directly related to the way that the human body is trapped inside these feedback loops. And I suppose I'm coming at this as a creative and an educator. I'm interested in, we are what we attend to, and I'm interested in thinking a lot more about that. And if a lot of our attention is taken up fixating on the latest outrage or doom scrolling or hate scrolling or doing some kind of homespun private eye, what are we missing out on? And more importantly, how does it make us feel? And how does it make us feel about society and politics and democracy? And quite often I find, and this is an issue that I struggle with, after a break, the impulse is to pick up the phone again because there might be something new or interesting. To me, choosing what we do with our attention isn't just good for us, it's actually radical, which is why the book's called Radical Attention. It's kind of a way of saying, I'm in charge of this, not you. It's also perhaps standing up against the kind of behavioralist thinking that comes out of Silicon Valley that wants to categorize us and put us into neat boxes. And that has a whole knock-on issue to do with identity politics, which I don't have room for here. But I think choosing what you attend to is active, not passive. And I'm interested in how we can get our minds back and use the technology rather than having it use us. And I think just to end, Steve Jobs said that he wanted technology to be a bicycle for the mind. And I feel a bit like it's turned into a kind of steamroller at the moment. And I really want to be able to find ways of talking about that and thinking about that without sounding, you know, like, oh, watching too much TV is bad for you. This is a whole different level of distraction, because it's at the level of our consciousness. And I think we've never encountered this kind of intense attention from social media companies on us as individuals, because we are the users and they can get something from us. They're trying to squeeze every last drop of commerce. Anyway, I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you. That was great. And I would recommend reading Julia's book. It's quite a compelling read and boils down all the arguments very well. At the end of your talk, you talked about mental health, which leads quite nicely onto our next speaker, who is Ben Carter. Ben is a senior lecturer in biostatics and mental health, statistics group lead at King's College London. I came across Ben because in the very little research that there is out there on this stuff, I found that Ben was involved in publishing a paper back in March, which showed that 4 in 10 university students are addicted to their smartphones, and that was covered across the media. But it's amazing looking back over the last few years. There's so little research out there, but luckily Ben has been working in this area. So over to you, Ben, if you want to unmute and
Thanks, Joe. Before I go on any further, is my connection stable? Can you all hear?
Yeah, that sounds good to me. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, I'll go on for about 8 or 10 minutes, but please jump in and ask questions should you wish to. So back in 2012, 2013, I was the director or the deputy director of the Master in Public Health course in Cardiff. Now, then nobody knew what public health was. Now, slightly different. We all have a better understanding. But I found my partner, who was a very stable person, they took a message from their email, that's from their boss late at night, and this stable person went well, they absolutely didn't sleep. And the following morning, they was very erratic. Now that made me think, could this be a problem? Is it to do with the smartphone? Is there a smartphone problem? We don't know. The year was 2013. Anyway, I carried out some work back in 2014, and I've been on this, I wouldn't say crusade, but this mission to just evaluate, qualify, and quantify whether it is a problem. Because in all honesty, there's massive benefits, but I promise you, there is an absolute raft of psychologists out there that want to demonstrate there is absolutely no link. A raft of them. Just this week, raise your hand if anybody saw the work that came out this week by the Oxford Institute that said that 30 years, of the last 30 years, there's no problem with social media, no link to mental health. So Joe's raised their hand. Gary, anybody else? Now, I wasn't surprised when I saw that finding, because I'm going to go into why that's happened. The first question you should ask yourself is, 30 years. Oh, that's interesting. What was 30 years ago? What level of social media did we have 30 years ago? Well, we didn't. If you make the water muddy, you can't see through it. And that's exactly what's been happening. Okay, so back in let's go back to the start. So back in 2014, we had some work that came up, and we looked at globally, so all the studies that looked at children that didn't take their device into the bedroom. Then we looked at two other groups. One group that took their device into the bedroom, and the third group that took their device into the bedroom and used their device whilst in the bedroom at night. So people that didn't take it in the bedroom at night, those that did take it into the bedroom at night but didn't use it, but those that also took it in the bedroom at night and did use it. 3 cohorts of children across the globe. And we absolutely demonstrated that the two groups that took the device into the bedroom and didn't use it, but took the device in the bedroom and did use it, they both had very negative consequences on their ability to sleep at night. Now, this made me think, well, clearly we addressed the first question that, yes, if you take your device into your bedroom at night, you have a chance of poorer sleep. But it also addresses some of the questions and thoughts that both previous speakers have raised, is the fact that there's something in there, and what is it? It's a connectivity, I would argue, the fact of an anticipation. So what is a smartphone? A smartphone is something that is constantly hanging off of us. It's on us, it's around us. I even bet many of you out there have looked at your device whilst I've been talking. Now, if you find that those that have used it, both that haven't used it, both had negative consequences on their sleep, you've got to ask yourself why. And I would argue that's because we may not have used it, but we've taken it in there for a reason, and we're anticipating some form of connection, some form of anticipated response. So you've got a response with the device that you're going to bed with that's right by your head, that you're probably looking at when you're going to bed. So we found that back in 2014, published in 2016, and that was the first body of work, and really laminated the fact that there could be a problem here. Back then, we didn't know, we thought it might be a problem. Now, I published some work in 2017 that looked at the link between possibly loneliness and then uses of devices. And there's a quote from the 1700s that I like to highlight here. It's, problems arise when we become tools of our tools. And never have we been in a position in history where we're not being controlled by our tools in this light. A quote from the 1700s. So when I moved to King's College London, the Institute of Psychology, Psychiatry and Neuroscience, one of the leading mental health institutes in the UK, I was able to work with a consultant in addictions. So whilst being a mathematician by training, I can start to find patterns and problem solve. You really need to tap into experts. And Dr. Nikki Kolk has absolutely transformed our thinking, because we started to ask ourselves, why are people not finding effects when others are? And I'm going to ask you a question which I've kind of posed earlier, but I'm going to do it again. The year is 1910. What is a screen? Is it the cinema? Is it Broadway? So when you use a term, let's transform ourselves by 100 years. The year is now 2005. What is a screen then? Is it a personal computer? Is it a TV? Is it an iPad? Okay, the year is now 2015. What is a screen? If I wrote what is a screen in the newspaper, or screens have links to mental health, you would say that it's a smartphone. Our interpretation of the term screen has changed over time. Now, I started this by saying the work that I published in 2016 said there's a connectivity. Now, you're not going to get that connectivity with a TV. It's passive. It's not active. It's a different form of, I call it exposure. And exposure is something that you link to harm. If you have a higher degree of problematic usage, you have a higher link to harm. And this term exposure to smartphones, is it the smartphone? Is it what we're using the smartphone for? We don't actually know. But what the emerging evidence is showing is problematic smartphone usage is absolutely linked to harm in many studies. However, if you say, have people used a screen over the last 30 years? Well, the chances are you won't find an effect because you've muddied the waters of what the exposure is. And if you muddy the water of what you're measuring, how you're measuring your problematic usage, you're not going to find anything. Okay, so working with Nikki, we started being scientific about our approach, about how we qualified addictive and problematic usage within the addictions field. And basically there's 5 domains. If you're interested, the paper is by first author Son et al. 2019, published in BMC's Psychiatry, and supplementary table 4 in there pins out nicely how the domains of problematic uses that's consistent with a behavioral addiction. So for example, drinking, smoking, gambling, drugs, all of these things have exactly the same principles within that, just operationalized different within a smartphone. So for example, the first one might be continued and increased desire to use over time. Also, that sense, that real sense of desire when you have the sense of loss. How do many people feel when that battery gets to the red, the last 5%? A little bit nervous? These are signs of exactly what drinkers would see when they're running out and there's nothing in the shelves. It's exactly the same. One of the more, the strongest links is actually continued use despite it's causing you harm. Now, where we are within the addictions field, you can never call something an addiction without gathering adequate evidence. And we're not at the point of saying this is an addiction. We're at the point of saying this is problematic usage, but we cannot we need to collect the data if we're going to be able to make that link. So I invite you to look at the supplementary material in there, and that will give a better understanding of how within the medical field we define something as an addiction. We look at the behavior for, and we actually map it across to separate domains. That work, where we looked at globally all of the evidence, and we started linking to both problematic usage, and we're going to use problematic usage in the time that we defined as this tool. And it was the tool we used to define problematic usage was the smartphone addiction scale. It's a 10-item scale where people more or less scoring on the higher ends of these scales, they're more likely to be defined as having problematic usage. And we absolutely found that there was associations with poorer mental health. Absolutely. We found the links to depression, anxiety. Now, what we have to caveat that is the evidence was largely from Asia. There was some from the US, but it was typically of young adults. So one subset of society was found to be at risk. But what we should also highlight is this problem is absolutely going to be dependent upon other demographics. For example, ethnicity, age, sex, and the type of usage. So in my demographic, I struggle with using my phone for work. Others would struggle using their device for something else. It's exactly what Julie was highlighting at, is that the smartphone itself, but it's actually what's underpinning that. And we don't know that yet. Joe, do you want me to stop there?
I think that's been 10 minutes, but why don't you just do round up?
Okay, so for future work going forward, we have funded work to look at the smartphone usage and self-harm, and we've got funded work, but that will be available in a few years. I've also got in 16 to 18-year-olds depression, anxiety, and we've collected over 700 children to see if we're using that problematic usage. Again, can link, and it looks very clearly that we can. Very happy to take questions on here or by email. I'm sure Joe will be happy to share my email with you. Thanks, Joe.
Thanks very much, Ben. Thank you, and hopefully look forward to working together on some more research in the future. Before I introduce our final speaker, I just want to remind people that if you want to ask a question, then either, because we'll do questions afterwards, if you raise your hand via the reactions button or put it in, say in the chat you want to ask a question, or if you want me to ask the question, then feel free to just write it in the chat box. But we'll hear from Bo, and then hopefully we'll do some questions after that. So just to introduce Bo quickly. Bo is another co-founder of Screenburn. We've been setting up this organisation together. And Bo has also been running courses on screen addiction for the past year, which she's going to talk about today in terms of some of her findings working with people. So over to you, Bo.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, hi everyone. It's good to see you all and be with you this evening. Yeah, I got involved with this really because I'm an artist, a musician, and I started to notice how, a bit like Julia was saying, how sort of 10 years ago, when I didn't have a smartphone or didn't really use it very much, I was just in kind of what they call flow state so much of the time, recording music all day long, so devoted to my passion. And in recent years, I've kind of noticed how that's dropped off and how much harder it is to kind of get into flow state and stay in flow state. So one of the pieces of research that's been done is about how when we have a distraction, so like say a text message coming in, just even seeing the text message come in, you might not even read it, will set you back I think it takes 23 minutes to get back to the place of momentum you were in your whatever you were doing before the distraction. So we basically, a lot of us don't really even ever go 20 minutes without looking at our phone. So we kind of never in flow state. And this is affecting our productivity and our creativity. And for me personally, it was just too high of a price to pay. It was like, I've got to get a handle on this. You know, I'm really passionate about creating. So that was where I started, and started working with my own addiction and looking at how I could change it, and came up with a number of different kind of tools and habits and boundaries that really helped me. And so yeah, I've been sharing those in the last year in these courses that Joe mentioned. And what I've noticed in the courses is that everybody has a very similar thing to share, really, that there is this sense of quite a lot of personal shame and guilt around their screen use, quite a kind of feeling of like one of the other speakers was saying, I know this is bad for me, but I can't really stop doing it. And there's a lot of kind of judgment and feeling of like, this is a personal weakness. And what happens when we get together and we talk about it in a group, people realize that like, oh, this is actually a universal problem. And it's not necessarily a personal failing. It's just that it's actually impossible not to engage with these devices addictively. That's how they're designed. So kind of helping people to move from like, I need to be better, to I need to create boundaries against this kind of force that's much bigger than me. And so we look at in the course, you know, again, like some of the other speakers have mentioned, how do I use this rather than letting it use me? And I think what's particularly hard about this form of addiction is that none of us can totally give it up cold turkey. I mean, unless you want to live a kind of life on a mountain meditating, which would be great. But most of us have to use it in some way for work or personal life. So how do we strike that balance of actually letting it work for us and not letting it kind of take over? So I share a couple of, there's about 13 different kind of habits and suggestions, and they're actually on our website on screenburn.org under resources. But yeah, I'll just pick out a couple now of some of the things we look at. One of them is about breaking down all of the different things that your phone does and reassigning those jobs to other lo-fi tools, like having a watch, having an alarm clock so you don't need your phone in your bedroom, having a diary, a camera, a notebook, all of these things that we think that actually having everything in one place is quite efficient, but it turns out that we go to the device for one thing and then we end up confused and distracted and stressed. So actually just returning the phone to what it really is, which is a communication device, and just using it for communication when that's convenient for us. So that's been one of the things that's really helped me. Another thing we've looked at is a bit like I was saying with the flow state, like return of the flow state, basically. So protecting your, what I call deep work. So anytime you're going to do something that's creative, or write an essay, or prepare a workshop, or whatever you do in your life, that requires that kind of deep level of attention that Julia was talking about, you just turn everything off, turn all the devices off and focus on this one thing, realizing that to start with, we're going to have those little like, oh, I need to check my thing. Where's my thing? I need to check something, don't I? And then after a while, once we get past a certain point, you can start to enter the flow state, which is, when you're completely wrapped up with what you're doing, you're completely devoted to it. And yeah, for me, I kind of let myself have a bit of procrastination time before entering any deep work, so I can kind of get that out of my system. And then eventually kind of submit to doing this thing that might be quite scary, but also quite wonderful. So that's one of the tools. The third one that I'll mention now is having at least one screen-free day a week. This is quite difficult for some people. For me, it's an amazing reset. It's kind of breaking the spell of screens. So just having a day where I will read, I will do gardening or go for a walk, be in nature, do something a bit unusual. And this question that's come up a couple of times tonight around like, what else would I do with my time? And that's something that we look at in the course, the screen addiction course, is, well, what are all the things that I love doing that I never get around to because my time and energy is being sucked into screens. So yeah, really rediscovering these kind of more lo-fi but very nourishing tasks and ways of being. I think the last thing I'll say is just really the kind of depth that the screen addictions touch for many of us in our lives that really come out in the course is that we look a little bit deeper at like, what am I reaching for when I'm reaching for my phone or my computer? What's the underneath side? And I think like any addiction, there's a lot underneath there. And I think, part of the work is to really look at how deeply this is tapping into a lot of pain, and so that's why as a group it's really good to kind of realize that we're not alone, we're not isolated, and that's part of the screen experience really, is being very isolated and individualist. And so something about the group experience of the screen addiction course is kind of getting how collective this problem is and how we can actually support each other to live the lives that we want to live and do the work that we want to do. And I think that's all I'll say for now. But